Okay, we're ready to get started. Good morning. My name is Gary Matsuoka, and we're here on a real warm Saturday morning at Laguna Hills Nursery in Santa Ana. It's being recorded, so I have to do the introduction. How many of you have not been to this class before? This class, this particular subject we're doing. Okay, so this is a long one, so I'll talk. So one of the things that our longtime customers know is that our views on soil and how to prepare them are totally different than you'll find at most garden centers and most garden experts. We're totally dismayed at what the industry is doing and not fixing. So the concept of soil from the industry, our industry, horticulture industry, is totally different than what it should be. And we'll talk about this now. So the problem we have is that the plants that we're getting and the soil amendments we're using are made out of ground up dead plants. Euphemistically, we call it compost, but in actuality, it's just a half-rotten dead plant. And I can't think of the worst medium or material to grow a plant in than a dead plant. It's like telling a person, oh, let's make your house and your furniture out of dead people. It's like, why would you do that? Now, the soil that plants' roots actually live in is this, sandy, loam. Loam is almost 100% quartz, silicon dioxide. If lightning hits the ground, you get glass. There's not much dead stuff in here. So in nature, or what the people who have gone around the world checking out the dirt said that the soil where plants grow in is basically more than 99% mineral, sand, salts, and clay, most of that being quartz, the majority of being quartz. There's less than 1% dead stuff in here, less than 1%. And it's primarily, of course, roots of plants that have died, but there's other things that die in the ground too, insects, protozoa, things that live in the soil tend to die and get eaten up by other things right away. So there's never that much of a buildup in the soil. Now, where the dead stuff belongs, because in nature there's 5 inches of dead stuff on top of the ground, called the duff layer. And I got to believe duff means dead stuff. But that's how it's set up. Now there's a couple of concepts, terms to learn first. So what we did, we figured, well, I didn't figure this out ourselves, but we talked to a soil researcher from NASA back in the early 90s, and he was dismayed how the industry was growing plants, saying that in the space program they don't use the same soils at all, and they don't know why our industry is so got its head stuck in the sand, pretty much. So the main way you influence your plants is the dirt. You can put, plants in the wrong place in your garden, shade plant in the sun, it will burn, it won't die. You put a sun plant in the shade, it gets stretchy, but it doesn't die. The main thing you can do is give it bad soil and bad conditions. That's what we're talking about today, is best soil and how to make the soil conditions better. So the soil is the key. If you get the soil right, everything else becomes easier. So the soil's got to provide 3 things for a plant primarily, but there's more, of course there's more. Let's take a typical plant. Now the plant gets energy from the sun. Leaves on plants are solar panels, so they're creating they're storing energy in the form of sugar. So plants take carbon dioxide and water from the soil, carbon dioxide from the air, and create sugar. Sugar is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen rearranged in a certain way. And plants, the main ingredient in a plant, if you grind up a plant and check it, is cellulose. Now cellulose is what wood is, what paper is cellulose. It's actually sugar molecules that are rearranged so we can't eat them. There's only a few organisms that can eat cellulose and get the energy out of it. Those are bacteria that live in the guts of beavers, cows, termites, things like that. They can consume cellulose and turn it back into sugar. But plants are cellulose. They make oxygen, but all the plant consumes oxygen. The only parts that make it are the little chloroplasts that live in the cells of the green parts of the plant. The stems consume oxygen, the roots consume oxygen, the roots need to breathe oxygen. In a plant, there's no system to get the oxygen from the leaves to the roots. So like in humans, you breathe air through into your mouth. The oxygen is circulated by your blood throughout your body so that your roots, your fingers don't have to breathe, just your mouth does. On a plant, the oxygen goes out into the air through the holes in the leaves. The air has to percolate or penetrate the soil to where the roots are so the roots can breathe too. So the roots need air. So some of the things that the soil provides for the plant, let's draw a little plant here. Or make it a tree. Put the roots in the ground. So what the plant needs from the soil, number one, it does need moisture. That is the most important thing. So the top of the plant's covered with wax. It makes it fairly waterproof, otherwise it'd dry out in a matter of minutes on a hot day. There are holes that open and close to let the carbon dioxide in, let the oxygen out, and water kind of escapes at that time too. The roots are kind of naked. They don't have much wax around them. They just absorb the water from the soil. So the soil's got to be moist around the roots. The soil's got to retain moisture. That's number one. If you pull a plant out of the ground on a hot day, the roots are allowed to dry up. The plant may be dead in hours. So number one is moisture. Two, oxygen. Or you can say gas exchange. So the air's got to be able to get to the roots. The oxygen's got to be able to get to the roots. The roots consume oxygen, give off carbon dioxide, just like we do. So some of the terms we use for moisture retention, that would be the porosity. Now, a lot of journalists use the term wrong. They say, "Oh, the clay pot can breathe. It's porous." No, when it's porous, it can hold water. The pores are the pore spaces in the soil. Clay has a lot of pore space. Clay pots have little tiny holes through them, so that's real porous. It holds the moisture well. To breathe oxygen, the soil's got to be permeable. That's the ability to airflow through the soil. The permeability, and I just don't see that written anywhere. The journalists don't know that term apparently, but they always talk about porous, which is the ability to hold water, not the other way. Number three, and they're not in this order. The plants need all these. Insulation. Roots can't handle either hot or cold. Their temperature range is somewhere between 35 degrees to about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So the soil's got to maintain the temperature at about that. And for stability, the soil's got to be pretty firm so the plant doesn't fall over. Trees, you don't want them to fall over in the ground. So it's got to be pretty stable. We've left out nutrition. Apparently, for most plants, the soil is not the source of nutrition. University of California, Davis did a survey of the soils around the Central Valley, and they said apparently the soil does not provide nutrition for plants. The plants recycle dead leaves. The plants are studying. The majority of plants recycle dead leaves that fall on top of the ground. Now, because they need to breathe air, the roots don't grow that deep. So there's no such thing as tap roots in the ground unless you happen to plant something at the bottom of a river gorge where it's all rocks and the air can go down way deep into the rocks. There's no root that goes, we haven't seen any roots in the city that go beyond about a foot, foot and a half. So you see when trees fall over, they always have pictures in the news of trees falling over. They're lifting up about this much dirt. So the roots stay near the surface where they can breathe and where the water can penetrate. In Southern California, the water never goes down very deep when you irrigate. So there's nothing for them to get further down. Now, if you're in the Midwest right now, it's where it's all flooded. Water's really deep. It's all water. Their soil is nothing but water back there. But here, there's nothing for the roots to get beyond about a foot in the ground. So the roots only go about a foot deep. They can grow very wide. So what the surveyors or the researchers have seen is that tree roots grow 3 to 20 times wider than the tree is tall. When I was in my 20s, I cut down a tree that was about 30 foot tall and dug out the roots because they're messing up my sewer. And the tree's roots were 100 feet long on a 30-foot tree, which is about right. And it was only 20 years old. 20-year-old house, 20-year-old tree. The roots were that long on it, so they can really go. Okay, so how does this soil do that? How does this soil do these things? So soil a good soil is called a loam. And here's another term that the journalists always are misusing. They're saying, it's make your soil rich and loamy by adding a lot of organic matter. No, that's not what that means. Loam just means that the soil has the 3 basic components of dirt, which is sand, silt, and clay. So you all know what sand is. You've been to the beach. Well, let's talk about how soil forms. So what soil is, you take a piece of granite and you grind it up and you get this. This is what soil is. So granite becomes good sandy loam. This stuff. So the lighter parts in granite are the quartz crystals. And when they break off, they become sand and silt. So sand and silt are quartz crystals, relatively round, because usually loam has been through a riverbed. So it's been tumbling around the river. So these particles come off and become fairly rounded by the time they're become loam. And then the darker specks in the granite, which is feldspar, which is quartz is silicon dioxide. Feldspar is silicon dioxide combined with things like aluminum or magnesium or some other minerals, and when those little dark specks become the clay. They're different. These crystals are make a flat plane, so they're like flakes. So clay acts like microscopic flakes. You can't see clay particles. They're real tiny. Sand and silt, you can see them. So clay is flat like cornflakes or confetti. Here's kind of a visual aid. Now, if this was the right sizes, the tennis balls are supposed to be the sand. Well, they'd be actually bowling ball size. And the little ping pong balls are supposed to be the clay, silt. And then the lentil seeds and confetti would probably been better, would be the clay in between them. Now the gaps between the sand and the silt create the permeability of the soil. And generally, those gaps are larger. The airflow through them depends a lot on the size of the holes. So the gaps between sand, the air can go through real easily. Silt, not quite as easy. In clay, they hardly move at all. There's a lot of friction in the clay, so it's hard for the air to get through there. So if you have enough sand, you have a highly permeable soil. Now, sand and silt being relatively round, what we know about round objects or spheres in physics is that round objects bunched together make up about 2/3 of the volume, or roughly 66, 67% of the volume is rock, quartz. The rest of the space is this is airspace. This is empty, so it's really permeable breathing. Clay doesn't breathe too well, so it turns out that if the clay content is higher than 1/3, you fill up all the gas between the bigger particles, and some of your soil doesn't breathe. So clay soil is any soil that's got about 35% clay content or higher. It doesn't take that much clay to ruin a sandy soil. All you need to have is 35% clay, and suddenly your soil won't breathe because all the gaps between the bigger particles are filled with the little clay particles. But that said, if you only have 35% clay, and there's a lot of areas of Orange County that are about 40% clay, you add equal amounts of sand to this, you now lower your clay content to about 20, and it breathes. So you can turn a clay soil that doesn't breathe into a sandier soil that does breathe just by mixing sand with it. So don't even listen to those people who tell you you add sand to clay and you get concrete. That's not true. I mean, all good soils have both sand, silt, and clay in them. And just because you add more sand doesn't suddenly turn it to concrete. You add sand to a clayish soil around here. We've been told by the ag agents that there's no soil in Orange County that has too much clay, that if you mixed it 50-50 with the soil with equal parts of sand, it'll become good breathing soil. That's what I've been told. That means there's no soils in Orange County that are above 60% clay.
So you just get sand, by bag sand?
You can. It's a pain to carry around.
Yeah.
So that's why we have other products for instead. But sand, silt, and clay, that's how it works. Now, how it holds moisture. So let's redraw some particle here. So you got sand particles, silt particles, the clay flakes. If you look through these particles, take a handful of soil from your ground and look at it underneath a microscope, you'll notice that there is a layer of water stuck to the sand. Turns out it's at least 1 molecule thick. So soil particles have a negative charge. They're ionic. They have a negative charge. Water is an ionic particle. When you have an oxygen molecule connected to 2 hydrogen molecules, they're kind of on one side like that. This has got positive on this side, this is negative. So the water's ionic, it sticks to this particle on the hydrogen side. The hydrogen molecules, atoms kind of stick around here, so it clings to the particles, and the water out beyond that kind of clings to them. So the water kind of sticks to soil particles. So the sand particles have a layer of at least 1 molecule thick layer of water. The silt does too, but the silt being smaller, the water is more of it. But clay can be as thin as only 20 or 30 molecules thick. So its layer of water relative to its size is a lot. So there's a lot. So clay soils hold a lot more water than and you can see it too. If you had confetti in here and you had water in there, how much water would stick to that versus big old round marbles? The water sticks to the confetti a lot better than it does to marbles. So Clay soils hold a lot more water. So if you have a foot of sand, apparently it can hold about half an inch of water before the water soaks through. If you have a foot of clay, it can hold about 2.5 inches of water. So up to 5 times as much water being held by clay than by a sandy soil. So clay, it's not that extreme here because our soils don't have as much clay, but generally, the clay helps hold the water, the sand helps it breathe. And those are the things that allow plants to grow faster. So the air doesn't change, but the amount of air, the atmosphere doesn't change. So the leaves always have the same thing, the same amount of sunlight pretty much. You can't do anything about that. You can't do anything about how much carbon dioxide is in the air. Of course, we're adding to it. If you breathe on your plants, they should grow faster. But the soil has a lot to do with how healthy the roots are. More air, the roots can breathe better. More water also. Unfortunately, in most soils, if it holds more water, it has less air. If it holds more air, it can hold less water. So you have some things that contradict each other like that. Now, another term you hear is make your soils rich by adding compost to it. Well, that's not how you make rich soil either. So in the old days, before 1900, really old days, you go way on beyond that, 1800s, 1700s, the richest soils in Orange County, where they did a lot of farming, Fountain Valley, Los Alamitos area, that area where it's all clay. So the rich soils were the clay soils because they had no irrigation back then. So after the rains were over, so the soils along the riverbeds are all sandy. And closer to these foothills too, it's very sandy. Anaheim is very sandy. Buena Park, sandy. But you go out closer to the ocean, well, the way this happens is our hills are sandy clay. The rivers move that soil down toward the ocean. The sand being heavier falls out of the river first. So if you're close to these hills, it's sand. If you go toward the ocean, the clay finally comes out as the water slows down as it enters the sea, and you get the clay settling out there. So it's clay. They said it's pretty much clay. The west side of the 405, pretty much sand. The east side of the 5, between the 5 and the hills. So, and then varying soil in between those two freeways. So the rich soils were considered originally the clay soils. It's the only soil that held enough water, and water does hold nutrients too. So the clay soils near the ocean were richer. They held more moisture. Farmers can actually get a crop in after the winter rains are over. By summer, they were too dry, but the inland, you couldn't do anything with it. It was always too dry. You couldn't grow a crop in the inland areas until they invented irrigation, which they did late 1800s. They started to irrigate. So, and then once they got the irrigation going, then they found out, in the sandy soils, the plants grow faster. As long as we irrigate it, the plants grow faster in the sandy soil. So now, the farmers don't want the clay loam. They prefer the sandy loam. So one way you can check and see what your soil has in it, get a jar, mayonnaise jar. So this is sandy loam soil. This was a organic farm we were next to for 4 years in Irvine. We were leasing land in Irvine for a while to grow plants. And the farmer said his soil was as good as he's ever grown a crop on. So we put it in a jar, about halfway up, water to the neck, a few drops of dish soap, shake it up real good, several minutes. Just keep shaking, so all the particles break up into little pieces. And then you set it on your counter and let it settle. Generally, the sand comes out first. Sand's a bigger particle, has less resistance than the water. Water is less resistant to it, so it just falls down to the bottom. So this soil is sand to about here. Now it's hard to tell sand from silt because they're similar particles, just a size change, but it's easy to tell the clay. So the clay on this sample, if you're close enough, it's about 3/32 of an inch, maybe more than a 1/16 of an inch on the surface. If I swirl this water, it'll kind of come up like grease from the surface of that. So it's only about that much clay. It's only about 5% to maybe 8% clay in this sample of dirt. So this is almost pure sand and silt, and mostly sand. I would say sand, gosh, 70 to 80% sand. So this soil has got great permeability. Farmers has to water daily and fertilize like crazy, and the plants grow like weeds. Whereas in the clay, they'll be slower because the roots don't get their air as fast. So good soil, well, sandy loam, let's put it this way. So sandy loam is going to be about, I would say, between 50 and 70% sand. And clay is going to be 5 to 20%. And silt is going to be somewhere that fills those two numbers. You can say that'd be somewhere in that range. But your clay has got to stay fairly low, but it's got to be some clay in there. Without clay at all, the soil doesn't hold enough water. In the old days, sandy loam was considered the poor soil. And you'll see some descriptions of certain crops that they say need the poor soil. They're telling you they need to breathe. So you get French tarragon. Doesn't like rich soil. Doesn't like all that compost in there. It needs the poor soil, which is the sandy soil. It's got to breathe. The roots have to breathe on plants. So apparently a lot of the plants that we're having trouble with need the poor soil. They need to breathe. And the fact that we're trying to grow them in compost is the main problem. So ground up wood, I mean, we've been brainwashed to believe that this is really rich. Well, it does have all the nutrients in it, but it's got no air. If you add water to compost, it becomes biologically active. So there's so much dead stuff ground up so fine in here. You put this in water, it consumes all the oxygen. So one of the big things that they're telling us, the biggest problem with homeowners and with everybody is we're overwatering and killing our plants. That term did not appear until the 1980s. So we could, before 1980, you can water your yard as much as you want. Nothing died. Now, if you water your yard too much, everything rots away. It's because the plants are being grown in compost. I hate to blame the colleges because the professors there have a curriculum they have to teach. It's like, okay, they've been handed this research that says that compost is the better place to grow plants than dirt. And they've told this to me face to face. You can't grow plants in dirt. You've got to grow them in compost. There's no nutrients in here. And I'm thinking to myself, boy, these guys come from another planet. I mean, it's not their fault because they're being given this research by their universities saying that they have to follow the research. They can't say what maybe they think. I mean, the advantage I have, when I was a kid, my dad grew all his plants in this. Watered them, I was told when I was a kid, oh, growing plants is easy. You water once a day, fertilize once a month, no problems. So when I was growing up, we had a guy watering the plants every day, never had any problems. Starting in the 1980s, the industry wanted, it was starting in the 60s really, they wanted to make the containers lighter because sandy loam is 110 pounds per cubic foot. So say a 5-gallon container. Now nowadays the 5-gallon containers are not square like in the old days. They were square, and they were a little taller. They're like a foot tall and square. So they're actually 5 gallons of dirt. And those things with this in them, they only filled them about this high because they were already like 40 pounds. Dirt's heavy. So they wanted to make it lighter. So they asked the universities, oh, let's make our soil lighter. Let's use something, material that you can use to make it lighter so we can lift this, so that women can lift the plants. What can I say? So the university came back and said, oh, make it half sand, half peat moss. Well, peat moss has always been expensive because it's not natural here. You have to bring it down from Canada or from some other location where there's a lot more water and lakes. So, but that works. Peat moss is the reeds that are not related to things we're growing. They died 10,000 years ago. They don't decompose very fast at all. It works pretty well. But they wanted something cheaper. The industry wanted something cheaper, so the university says, okay, well, if you make it 1/3 ground up fir bark, which is a lot cheaper, it's local source in the Sierras, in the local mills, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, it'll still work. So they started going that route in the 60s and 70s. But what was going on was that a lot of the growers stopped, a lot of the soil companies said, let's just get rid of the peat. Because the peat's so expensive. So this one with wood shavings and soil, and they didn't even use sand, they used dirt and wood shavings. And so we had started having problems with all our plants in the 80s. The soil would be shrinking because the wood was decomposing, and the plants would rot. So the agricultural agents at the time came in and told my dad in the 80s, you can't water your plants every day, you're going to rot them. What's wrong with you? So my dad was puzzled because he had watered everything in his nursery every day and up until that point. And at that point, I was back from college, decided to work in our industry. And he said, you figure this out. So it took me about 10 years to figure out wasn't the water. But in the meantime, we had to make all these new rules that if you couldn't water every day, you'd have to wait until that compost in the pot looked dry before you can water. Because if it looked wet at all on the surface, it was saturated below that, and saturated means there's no air spaces, so the roots were just rotting. They couldn't breathe anything because what's wrong? So clean water coming out of the faucets, 6 to 8 parts per million of oxygen. The water district knows that to avoid killing plants that you water, there has to be enough oxygen in the water for the roots to breathe, and 6 to 8 is more than enough. Fish need the same thing. There has to be oxygen enough in the water for fish to breathe. So you don't want to put water in your fish tank and suddenly all your fish die. So the water that they send in through the tap, 6 to 8 parts per million. Plants need around 5 to 7. A few plants can get by down around 3 parts per million of oxygen. So water itself won't drown a plant. You can grow a plant and water all its life. If the water's clean, it's got plenty of oxygen as long as it doesn't sit too long. But if it's got, like most people here have grown an avocado, from pit, put a pit in a glass of water. We've seen avocado trees in a glass of water for 3 years. As long as the water is free to circulate in the glass, the oxygen is maintained in that water. The roots are using the oxygen, giving off carbon dioxide, but the water can circulate in there, and there's nothing dead in that water, then the oxygen's adequate. And avocados are the most sensitive tree crop to low oxygen level. One of their main things is they rot. And you go in their nursery, they'll tell you, oh, you got to make sure your avocado tree gets bone dry between watering. They don't want you to water it because it always rots. That's because they grow them in compost. So compost, being a dead plant rotting, It's consuming oxygen at an extremely high rate. You put this in a cup of water within about 3 or 4 days, it smells like a sewer in that water. It's using oxygen faster than that water can replenish itself from the surface. There's too much biological activity in all these little, if this was a piece of wood, it wouldn't decompose very fast. Or a solid branch or a solid root. There's not much surface area there, but once you chop it into real tiny pieces like this, it's decomposed. There's so much surface area to decompose those bacteria and protozoa and whatever else is doing it. They're going to town on this thing. If you put it in water, it's just decomposing really fast. Now, people have told me, no, this is finished compost. Well, when compost is finished, it's carbon dioxide and water. There's nothing left. So this is, the fastest decomposition may be gone, but it's still decomposing at a very high rate. So it won't burn anymore. You make a big compost pile. Initially, that thing can catch on fire. It's so hot. So they have to watch the temperature of those things. You see the thermometers, and they're making sure it doesn't get too hot in there. Yes.
Did you put compost on top of the soil?
Definitely.
Okay. Just don't dig it in.
Right. So that's the theme of what we're coming up to. So anyway, this stuff, they're growing plants in here, and you water that thing every day. There's no air in there. The roots just rot. I mean, the compost itself can rot the roots without any other help. But you lower the oxygen level in where the roots are, the low oxygen levels promotes root rot diseases. But compost shouldn't be around living plants. It shouldn't be around the living parts of plants. I remember once I covered a plant with compost, and you uncover it a week later and all the leaves are dissolving because the compost is eating the plant. That's what the bacteria in here is supposed to do. It's supposed to consume plant matter. So you don't want it on the leaves. You don't want it where the roots are. The roots should be in this. This is where the roots should be living, in a clean home, not where all this dead stuff is. So that's the problem we have with the industry right now, is that they're being told to grow plants in compost. The research report that tells them this, and I've read several of them, they said, well, it takes 3 months to grow a plant, get a plant ready to grow in a nursery. So you have a choice. You can put it in sandy loam, or you can put it in compost. Which one will it grow better in? Well, of course, there's no nutrition at all in here. There's some nutrition in here. Of course, they add it too. But when compost is fairly young, they age it only 3 months. So they age ground up bark for 3 months. Usually it's bark, and it's still very permeable. Plus, it has some nutritional value. Plus, a lot of so it's very airy. It's more airy than this. As long as you water a lot, it's a great growing medium for a while. So what the research shows is you compost the bark for 3 months so that you take the hot decomposition out of it. You can grow plants in it for 5 months. Now, in the United States, most nurseries, because they freeze in the winter if they're left in a pot, get their plants in early spring, March or April, and they have to sell them by September. Because, if you're in Maine and you get to October, the plants in the pots in your nursery all freeze to death unless you put them inside your greenhouse. So they get rid of them, and they never see them beyond 5 months, 6 months. So this medium, ground up wood or bark, is a good growing medium apparently for 5 months. Beyond that, you have to do one of 3 things. You either have to put it in a bigger pot with fresh medium around it so it can breathe again. You have to sell it, or you have to discard it, because this becomes toxic beyond 5 months because the permeability is dropping off too low. So the roots aren't getting enough air. They're starting to rot in the pot. For some reason, our industry doesn't think this is a problem. So they'll let the customer take the plant home, put it in the ground, it rots the next year, rots within a couple years. We have one company that I planted. My last house I had purchased, I planted the whole entire yard. from one company, all the plants died 3 years after being installed, all right underneath the stem of the plant. We knew it was their soil. I had 2 other companies, the plants never died. One other company, they died within 5. One other company, they died within 10. So we kind of learned a lot about dirt by watching their plants die in the garden. And they used the same mixtures. So we knew what was going on. One company was the one that died in 3 years, 90% wood product. They call it redwood grind, really finely ground up redwood. So it acts more like peat moss instead of wood shavings. Losing all its permeability within 3 years. The plants would die within 3 years. Another company was using bigger chunks of bark. Plants made it through 5. The companies that lasted the longest, one did not use any wood product at all. It's peat moss and perlite. No wood product. Their plants never had a problem with theirs. The other 2 companies, redwood sawdust and sand. About 3/4 to 1/4 sand. And the redwood shavings last long enough that the plant seems to get out of that zone before it rots away. So anyway, we've seen that. So when we buy plants, and we try to get it from the companies either whose soil works better than the rest. A lot of the plants, half the plants in nursery we grew ourselves. I mean, we can't stand selling things we know are going to die. There's some other plants that are able to, so not all roots are created equal. Plant roots can handle various levels of oxygen before they rot. We know one of the best out there is pear trees. So with pear trees, you see a lot of ornamental pears in the neighborhoods because they don't die of root rot. Lilies, like daylilies, don't seem to rot. You can have really nasty soil around a lily and nothing ever happens to it. Canna lilies can handle the soil too, but canna lilies do something else. Their roots, their stems migrate. So in a year, this thing will be over here. Won't be in that stuff anymore. Even though this is really bad soil in here, it will be over here next year. It won't care. Same with things like boysenberries. I buy this boysenberry from probably the worst company I can get it from. However, the boysenberry will be migrating too. It'll grow roots and send up new shoots outside of this zone. Now we notice that if the plants don't like the roots, one of the things they do a lot is get brown tip leaves. So don't listen to people say, oh, it's sunburning or it's salt burn. I hear that term all the time, salt burn. This year we don't have a salt problem. We had enough rain to wash all the salts away. If you have 3 or 4 years of drought in a row, you might get salt burn. But this is not salt burn. This means not enough good roots. So, yes.
Do you go over and buy something and like help put it into the soil? You're not sure?
Well, that's part of this lecture.
Okay.
So here's a plant that's just about failing. If you look at the dirt, it's getting pretty slimy. I don't know if you can see the sheen from back there. It's getting pretty slimy. This was the soil that was about 90% wood product and maybe 10% perlite. So it's not, the plant's not happy anymore. This one's hanging in there, but so they'll tell you, oh, you overwatered this. Look, it's all rotten. So we've started making our own soils, and one of the plants that we grow a lot are gardenias because they're probably the most failure among our customers, the most well-known failure. This is a younger one here, but we developed our top pot primarily for gardenias. So this is our #1 selling soil. We want to make sure that gardenias would live in here for essentially forever. So this plant's been in here more than a year. You can see the roots look pretty nice still. So healthy roots are light colored. They're not, I mean, you look at a lot of plants that are black. That's not very healthy. Now, they can turn black from sunburn. You have to expose the pot to the sun. The sides exposed sun will burn up because the temperature of the container gets too hot. But even on this one, you can see this is the side that was facing the sun. Not too bad. The other side is really happy. and this has been in the pot more than a year. That's probably how old these are too. We've only had these about 3 months though in the nursery. That's pretty sad when they do that within 3 months. So this is a younger one. This we just potted this one up 2 months ago. It's not ready to sell yet, but we expect our gardenias to do well and not have the problem. I mean, gardenias, gardenias, people, cringe when they think about them, but we found gardenias to be about the easiest plant in the world to grow. I mean, you break off a piece of stem this big, you stick in air soil, it grows. It's really, as long as the roots have enough oxygen, darn things are easy. It's just when they're in compost, they just turn yellow and the leaves get, you find a gardenia in a nursery, the leaves are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. That's to us a sign of no roots. So the size of the leaf, the color of the leaf, and the brown tips are all signs of no roots. Yeah, it's unfortunate. Most of the indoor plants, the soil they're using now, at least there's no wood in here. That's the only good thing. They found that they just go pure. This is 90% peat, 10% perlite, might be 88% peat, 10% perlite. It works really well for about a year. And then the peat moss starts getting too sludgy, you can't breathe anymore. I mean, things don't grow in peat bogs for a reason. And you get peat moss put in a pot, you water it, it turns back into a peat bog. So this plant's got about a year. Beyond that, well, if you manage your watering very carefully, let this thing go bone dry so the air can get back in through the peat, you got a chance. And of course, the peat shrinks too when it's dry, so you get more air around the roots. But if you want it to do well, you got to take this soil off, put on something more permanent like our top pot here, and then it'll be happy the rest of its life. So. Okay, I lost my track here. So we talked about water retention, permeability. Now, nature has a way of making the clay soil breathe better. So if you have clay soil, what you're supposed to do with it is just put mulch on top, organic stuff on top of the soil. So the way nature improves its own soil is the decomposing dead stuff on top of the ground, dead leaves on top of the ground. As the bacteria and fungi break it down, the dead stuff releases something called lignin to the soil. Lignin is the glue that glues the plant together. So plants are made out of strands of cellulose held together by a glue made out of sugar also, called lignin. But nothing eats lignin. So when this leaf is dissolved by fungi or bacteria, the lignin is then free to hit the dirt, and it starts gluing the soil particles into bigger clumps. So the clay soils, instead of being all this real fine stuff that air can't get through, is clumping up into bigger pieces that act like sand. So if you have a compost pile, you dig underneath, the soil is what is called pilling. It's all creating kind of this, well, they call it aggregation, granulation. The soil is becoming bigger chunks from this lignin that's being released into the ground. So that's one way you can improve clay. Just put a whole bunch of dead stuff on top of it, water it, the lignin's released, the dead stuff disappears, the soil below it becomes more chunky. And then the microscopic and bigger worms too will punch holes through all that stuff. Now in nature, just so you know, the biggest recycler of plant material is not bacteria. So your compost pile is one way to recycle nutrients. The bacteria eat the dead stuff. When they die, if they die, their bodies release the nutrients and plants can pick it up. Well, the main recycler in nature is not bacteria, it's a fungus. And 95% of all plant species known use this to get their nutrients from the dead stuff laying on top of the ground. So one mycorrhizal fungus, you'll probably be familiar with the name truffles. So truffles are the fungus that lives under oak trees in France that recycle the dead oak leaves on top of the ground and return the nutrients to the oak tree. So the mycorrhizal fungus is actually attached directly to the roots of the tree to most plants. They have a mycorrhizal fungus. In fact, they didn't discover mycorrhizal fungus till the 1950s. They didn't know it was there because they couldn't tell that the white roots in the ground were not the roots of the plant. They thought it was, they thought it was the roots of the plant. They didn't know that these white things in the ground were not the plant. They were this fungus attached to the plant. So they said, so what they're telling us now is that 80% of the roots of a tree are actually this fungus. They make up 80% of the root mass of a tree is actually this fungus that's attached to the roots of the tree. And it goes up into this layer of dead leaves on top of the ground. So let's say you got the plant roots down here, and you have the dead leaves, and the dead leaves are in a layer about 5 inches thick throughout the world. That's the average. And the mycorrhizal fungus is doing this. Its home is up in the duff layer there. So it's consuming all these dead leaves and sending the nutrients back into this tree. So in a climax ecosystem, this is a closed system. That tree is getting all the nutrients back from its own dead leaves, and the weeds can't grow. So weeds in nature, most weeds are called pioneer plants. So if you clear off an empty lot and it rains or you water it, the pioneer plants grow. So there's no mycorrhizal fungus there initially. There's nothing for them to consume. But there are specialized weeds, most of them being grasses, some like mustard plants and other things. A lot of things you see along riverbeds are the pioneer plants. They have really incredible root systems that are almost like mycorrhizal fungus that can gather up the nutrients they need from the really poor soils that exist. And so these pioneer plants start growing, these weeds start growing. And then when they make enough dead stuff on top of the ground, the mycorrhizal fungus comes in, takes over, steals all their nutrients, so there's nothing left. And the woody plants grow, the trees and the shrubs that use the mycorrhizal system start growing. So there's only a few crops and plants that we grow that don't have mycorrhizal fungi. One that's well known would be the Brassicaceae family, which is cabbage, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, mustard, turnips, radishes. That family of plants doesn't really like the mycorrhizal fungus around it. It'd rather do it its own thing. A lot of grasses can do their own thing too. A lot of plants can go both ways. They can use the mycorrhizal fungus or they can go on their own. So this is how nature's supposed to operate. Now, this layer of stuff on top generally is a source of nutrition for most plants. It also insulates the ground really well by about 20 degrees, 25 degrees. So if you have 3 inches of dead stuff on the ground, your soil, like they said, bare dirt with weather like we're having right now, 90-degree day, bare dirt 1 foot deep where the roots live, 120 degrees. Way high. You put 3 inches of mulch on top, 85. That's what the research shows. So it keeps the ground livable to the surface. If you have bare dirt around your plants, you're going, okay, I can't live near the surface. I got to go deeper, but I can't breathe there. So the plants just don't look good. Roses without a mulch on top of the ground, they always look cooked. Put a mulch on top to insulate the ground, suddenly the root systems become a lot bigger, a lot happier, and the plants look a lot better. So that mulch and organic is better on the surface is certainly beneficial. Yes.
Okay. I think I know the answer to this, but if I was going to go make my own mulch, can I use grass clippings with leaves, or would you not use grass clippings?
Well, you just have to be careful the texture. If it's too fine, sometimes the air won't move through it. So they say don't go more than a couple inches of grass clippings because the air doesn't move through that. It dismats too easily. I'm going to pass these out. So we'll talk a little about, before we get into planting technique, we'll talk a little about nutrition. Let's talk about watering first. So watering, if you have the right soil in a pot, there's no such thing as overwatering. You couldn't overwater this gardenia in this pot because there's drain holes at the bottom. The water's not going to sit in there. The only way you can overwater this gardenia, if the water sat in this pot for about a week, then the roots would eventually use up all the oxygen. The soil in here, the soil particles, keeps the water from circulating well enough to get re-oxygenated from the surface. So if the water was sitting here for a week, it might overwater. But if you have a pot with a drain hole at the bottom, there's no way you should overwater it. The ground's almost the same thing. Unless the ground actually puddles there and the water sits there for a long time, there's no way you should be able to overwater the ground. I mean, 2 years ago when we had that big snowfall in the Sierras and the water was coming down, the water district were telling the farmers, turn on your sprinklers, don't turn them off. Just flood everything. We got to get this water into the ground before it goes out to the ocean. And the farmers had no trouble with that. They know, if they just water day and night, nothing happens to their plants. They just build up a lot. The water just goes deeper and deeper and builds up the water table underneath the plants. That's what they're trying to do that way. But too much water should not hurt plants unless it just forms a puddle and sits there. So all this thing we've heard about overwatering is not true. Now, the only way you can ever know how deep the water is in your garden is to have a metal rod or wood dowel. I forgot to bring one in. A stick about pencil thick, like 3/8-inch rebar is good. That's what the farmers used to walk around their fields. A wood dowel about the same thickness, and it can be up to finger thickness. It's not that critical. How far you can push things through soil is determined by the moisture. So if a block of clay is wet, modeling clay, you can push anything through it. If it's dry, you can't push anything through it. There's just no way. And the same moisture is what plants can get. If the soil is wet enough to push an object through, it's wet enough for the plant. Now, plants' roots go down about a foot. So if you can keep that entire top foot layer of soil moist, your plants are fine. They're happy. So that means you can walk around with a piece of rebar or a wood dowel and push it into your soil where you're watering at a foot deep. If you can't, it's too dry for that plant to be happy. I mean, plants don't have to be happy. I mean, they can be under stress. If you have a hedge or just an ornamental green shrub or something you really don't want to grow, it can probably survive on 5 inches of moisture in the ground. But if you have a production plant, a rose you want to make flowers or vegetables you want to produce something, you got to keep their entire root system moist or else they shut down. So you should be able to push a stick in the ground about a foot deep where you're watering your plants.
How far deep for trees?
Same. Their roots don't go any deeper. I mean, farmland is a little bit better than our land here, so they expect 1.5 feet. So on farms, they carry around a 4-foot long rebar, and they expect to be able to push it 1.5 feet deep. If you have good soil, 1.5 feet. If you got clay soil, if you can push in 8 inches, that's probably in the entire root system of your plant. Roots do not grow as deep in clay as they do in sandy soils. So. And the other thing to know about watering is the average soil in Orange County only can absorb 1/4 inch of water per hour. So if it rains more than 1/4 inch of water in an hour, you get puddles and you start getting runoff. And 1/4 inch of water is like 4 minutes with sprinklers. So the water district only wants you to water 4 minutes max with sprinklers, but you can water, but to get, like this time of year, a lawn's supposed to have 44 minutes of watering. So that means you got to water 11 4-minute periods per week, or say 14 3-minute periods per week to get that. So twice a day, 3 minutes, they'll keep the moisture at about a foot deep on a regular lawn. And most fruit trees and vegetables need about the same amount. They're not that different from grass. They say an average orange tree in Riverside, which is a little bit drier than Orange County, 90-degree day in June, would use 50 gallons of water per day. That's where all your water goes to. The agricultural industry is over 70% of the water in California goes to farms, because that's how much water plants use. So that's.
Well, now that you said that, it's just curiosity, it doesn't have to be that much of a class. So on all of these farms in California, we have so many different kinds of agriculture. What do they do about soil?
Nothing.
They just grow it in the native soil? They don't mulch it and all that?
Okay, so Kellogg's, who I've had clashes with, I went out to dinner with Hap Kellogg III about 10 years ago because he was surprised we quit selling their grow mulch, because on the grow mulch bag it says 50-50 or with the soil. I said, that's too much. I asked him, well, how much, because he says, well, we've been putting they recycle human waste. Nitrohumus was just pure human waste. So I asked him, well, how much do you put on a farm? 5 cubic yards per acre. Well, if you spread 5 cubic yards of their stuff over an acre, it's like this thick. You can see it. So that's how much back in the 60s and 70s, when we would prepare a yard, we would put 1 bag of their sewage sludge over 100 square feet of soil. And that was our soil prep. That's like this thick. Turn it in, we'd be happy. The plants would do fine. So that little amount of organic matter, which is, if you till that in a foot deep with the tillers, that's like 1% organic. I mean, they said, University of California, Davis did a survey of California farms in 2000. They wanted to see if the organic content of the soil was holding up, because in the year 1950, the last time they had checked it, the average organic content of the soil in farms in California was 0.9%, which is what it is in nature. They want to make sure it wasn't dropping off. So they went around in 2000 and checked the farm. They said, perfect, 1.1%. So that's what they want to see, is about 1% organic matter in the soil. And here, we're being told, oh, make your soil 50%. That can kill a lot of things if you don't manage your watering extremely well. So University of California, Davis says there are some farms in the Delta region of California that are on reclaimed marshland. That soil is 40% organic. They said they can only grow seasonal crops, and they have to manage their watering very carefully, because those plants rot very easily. And that's what we're doing to our yard. You put that much organic matter in the ground, your yard rots really easily. You have to manage that watering so it dries out. The air can get back in there when the water's not in there. So we've made our yards really sensitive by adding all that organic matter. Okay, watering, fertilizer. So on this sheet I gave you on the back, it shows what plants are made out of. So carbon, oxygen, hydrogen are the main things. 45%, 45%, 6%. We don't have to think about those, because the carbon and the oxygen come from carbon dioxide, and the hydrogen and the oxygen come from water. So we don't have to think about those at all, but that's the majority of a plant. Nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. Whoops, I'll put them this way. Nitrogen is 1.5%, potassium is 1%, phosphorus is 0.2. So these are called the macronutrients. Those are the things we have to think about the most. The ratio between nitrogen and potassium is about the potassium is about 2/3 of the nitrogen. And the phosphorus is way lower than that. So the fertilizers I kind of like, if you want to mirror that, a 6:1:2 ratio. Well, actually, we have one on the shelf that's 6:8. Well, if it was about 6 nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, 6:1:4 would almost be the ideal if you wanted to match what a plant is. Between those three, because they usually on boxes put them in that order: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. They actually need more potassium than phosphorus. But if you had that ratio, that's about what a young plant at least is. And then calcium. Calcium we don't think about enough because there's a lot in the ground, but it's actually higher than phosphorus. Then magnesium 0.2, sulfur 0.1. Those are the minor nutrients. And then the micronutrients are the rest. And this is where, the marketing really did something bad to us. They made sure we add enough iron to plants. It's like humans. You don't need that much iron. So the iron content of a plant, 0.01, chlorine, 0.01, manganese, 0.005, boron, 0.002, zinc, 0.002, copper, 0.006, molybdenum, 0.0001, nickel and cobalt, real small. But they're all necessary. Most cells of a plant have all these minerals in them, so you can't say that one's more important than the other. They all should be there. So in plants, the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, cellulose is the bulk of a plant. The wood of a plant is that, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Nitrogen is the membranes. So the membranes in a plant, we're all membranes. Our hair, our skin is all membranes. That's nitrogen. Phosphorus is the energy transfer molecule in animals and plants. So if you've taken any biochemistry, and I took 4 years of it, ATP and ADP are the adenine triphosphate, adenine diphosphate are the energy transfer molecules where you take the energy from sugar or sunlight or whatnot and transfer it to something else. So you have to have the phosphorus. So phosphorus transfers energy. Potassium, if we're low on potassium, our blood, it's the main salt in our blood is potassium. The main salt in plant sap is potassium. The main salt in fruit juice is potassium. So it makes up the juice of the plant. It doesn't have any particular thing it does. It just is the juice. Makes up the juice of the plant. Calcium is associated with wood. A lot of the metals, magnesium, iron, zinc, copper, a lot of those are involved in the little molecules like the chloroplast molecule. So that makes the plant green. So it's involved with that. So if you're missing any of those metal minerals, your plants look pale. So a lot of these things change the color of the plants if you don't have them. Because the chloroplast, which is green, can't, actually it's not green, it just appears green because it filters out all the other colors. I don't know, some really complicated thing like that. But anyway, all those little minerals are involved with enzymes and complicated reactions that the plants make. Now, there's one other mineral that they're starting to add to this, silicon. When plants were grown in dirt, they didn't think plants needed silicon. But now that they're growing plants not in dirt, they're going, hey, if we spray this plant with silicon, it looks better. It's stiffer. It's like, okay, come on, folks, let's grow plants in dirt again. But it's so crazy what they're doing. I mean, they're growing plants in things that are not dirt, and suddenly they find all these problems that they have to fix. Too much water, not enough nutrients, all this stuff goes on. So I've been told there's a soil and plant lab in Anaheim. I've talked to the guys, they're always saying, well, we're always analyzing what the orchards and farms are needing, and we can't tell. So they said homeowners shouldn't be able to tell either. So they said, just stick with something organic, and you'll be in the ballpark. If you go chemical fertilizer, unless the chemical is really well made, you can be off, and you'll never find your way back. So, because they said they see this plant, and they go, oh, it's got to be iron, and they go to lab, oh, zinc. If you put iron on there, you make the problem worse. So they're saying stay with something organic. Now, we like the seed meals, because you can figure whatever was in the seed was meant for this baby plant. So this is like baby food for plants. So the seed meals like neem seed meal, cottonseed meal, those are wonderful.
So that's like an all-purpose fertilizer?
It was for the plant. If the baby plant can live on what's in the seed, you bet the plant can live on what's in this. So the seed meals are actually very, very good. When I was a kid, my dad just had 3 fertilizers. They fertilized everything with bone meal, blood meal, and cottonseed meal. Those were the 3. 100-pound bags of each.
And those were for vegetables?
That's all I knew. Bone meal, blood meal. Blood meal happens to be all nitrogen. Bone meal is all phosphorus, and we don't even use bone meal more because they found out bones just take too long to break down. It's like 5 years later, then news become available. The cottonseed meal has always been good. So even though they only list 621, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, everything else is in there. They have all the minor and the micronutrients in there too. Same with neem seed meal. One reason we like neem seed meal is because it has some insecticidal properties to it. So the insects have a harder time, little bugs and things, they have a harder time living in here. A lot of seeds have poisons in them that prevents things from eating them. So these, if we're talking about fertilizers, these are your simple fertilizers. There's only one material in here. It's neem seed. It's got a lot of different minerals in it, but it's only one material. Most people buy the blended organics, like Dr. Earth is just a blend of different dead things. So fish meal, bone meal, feather meal, alfalfa meal, potassium sulfate, fish meal, kelp meal, rock phosphate, kelp flour. So this is a blend of organic things, which is fine. Here's another simple, just plain blood meal. I mean, when I was a kid, I thought, boy, if a tablespoon is good, a shovelful was even better. So I put a shovelful on a plant in a pot this big, and about a week later, all these maggots are running out of the pot. Didn't hurt the plant though.
Blood meal is it simply just
Dried cow's blood.
that's all it is?
Yeah.
Just, okay.
I mean, when I was growing up, we had this guy that came to the nursery. He says, "Oh, my roses look so good. I'm the head of the blood bank over here. When the blood gets too old, we just dump it on the roses."
And it worked.
Now, they can't do that anymore, but he says, yeah, that made the best looking roses. Oh, there's one thing that you can add to the soil that actually makes sense, humic acid. So in the world, there are such things as rich black soil. They're usually found near volcanoes, but hot wildfires will cause it too. So what makes the soil rich and black? So, in some journal or horticultural things, you'll see, well, add compost, your soil becomes rich and black. Well, if you add compost to the ground, it becomes rich and black. It's because you're creating sewer gases, which are black, and it's like sulfur dioxide, it's poison. It's poison to the plants if you make it black using compost. If your soil is real dark, there's something wrong with it naturally, if you do it that way. You want light-colored soil for the most part. But there are rich black soils in the world. They have a natural charcoal content of only about 1 to 2%. So the soil researchers analyzed the black soils. They said, okay, near this volcano, you got this flow of hot gas that came out of the volcano. All the trees just incinerated on immediately, but there's no oxygen around, so they all turned to charcoal. The soil, as the trees ground up over the years, they became this real fine black part of the soil, and the charcoal holds nutrients really, really well. That's why it's used in filters. Charcoal, all the minerals are attracted to it. Soil organisms like to be around it. It makes the soils look black, even though it's only 2%. It makes them look black and be rich for almost forever. They said they can go down to Central America in the jungles, find a patch of the jungle that's really, really green, dig down to find a campsite from 10,000 years ago. They'll find the charcoal in the ground, the plants growing above it. So it can make the soil rich and black. Now, charcoal has always been really expensive. So we sell bags of charcoal, but it's expensive. And we added charcoal to our soil to make it get that natural richness to it. That's why it costs a lot. Because charcoal, 1 cubic foot of charcoal is more than $50 on the wholesale level, because it takes energy to make it. If you can find charcoal, that's one thing. If you make it, it's really, really expensive. So that's one of the big things in agriculture right now, is how to turn the crop waste, like corn cobs, all this rice chaff and all this stuff, into charcoal to make your ground richer. So they're trying to figure out how to do that. Yes?
People used to, I guess, raise the area they were going to eventually sow the following season. Was that something that would benefit? I'm assuming it's adding charcoal into the soil.
If it's charcoal, if it's ash, it doesn't help that as much.
Oh, I see. I guess.
So ash and charcoal ash, if you burn things up and they oxidize totally, they go into white ash. That doesn't do a whole lot. That's just potassium and a few other minerals. But the charcoal is when it's heated up at real high temperatures, but it doesn't turn to ash. It's not oxidized. It's a totally different thing. It's organic, but it doesn't react at all at that point. It's just a storage medium. So it's got to be under low oxygen levels. So the inside of a big log in a forest fire will turn to charcoal. The outside of it will turn to ash. So it's different. But making charcoal is expensive. But there are people, investing a lot of money in doing it, because if you can turn all your agricultural waste into charcoal, you make your soil richer at the same time instead of throwing it away. Okay, so the fertilizer. So if you add, so this is not quite as good as charcoal, but it's close. This is a coal deposit from Texas. So this granular humic acids, you add it to your soil. We've added it to dirt, and sometimes algae suddenly starts growing on the ground because it holds the nutrients there for the algae to start growing. So it makes all the fertilizers work better. So if you look at almost any organic fertilizer, this humic acids are coal deposits in there. They put it in because they know it makes it work better. Contains 6% humic acids. This pure stuff is 50% humic acids in here. So, and you only have to add it once. You add this once. Now there's a famous product that's being sold that touts that theirs does is John and Bob's Soil Optimizer is humic acids. They charge a lot because they advertise a lot, but this is just as good. There's one other fertilizer there that's almost this concentrated in humic acid. It's called Grow Power. So Grow Power fertilizer, we don't sell it. You have to buy it direct. We have to buy a whole truckload at a time. But it's 45% humic acids. It makes its fertilizer work better than it should. So, and it makes all the other fertilizers work better too. Now there's some interesting chemical fertilizers out there. So we use in the nursery Osmocote a lot. This is a time-release fertilizer. Now, most old-fashioned chemical fertilizers just say, we're balanced, we've got 3 minerals in it. There's a lot more than 3. So this company here decided they would make them the best on the market. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They've got 11. If you take away carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, you can take away the nickel and the cobalt. That leaves you like 12 or 11 or 12 minerals left. And this covers just about all of those. So it doesn't have cobalt, doesn't have nickel, but it's got pretty much everything else in it, and it's a time release on top of that. It's supposed to last 6 months. So we use it in the nursery because it's easy. If I throw this in a container on the surface and you water it, sometimes it just blows it right out again because it's very light. It's like you should cover this with mulch, or if you have a mulch layer on the ground, you throw this on there, it stays in place. But without that in the pot, sometimes it won't sit around very long. So we like the Osmocote better. It kind of just sits on the dirt and does its thing. But there are some other chemical fertilizers that were very well done that are of note. So Magnum Rose Food, this was made by a guy. Dr. Can't remember his name now. He volunteered at Rose Hills in Whittier. So he was a chemist, and he decided to see what the roses there needed. So he created this for Rose Hills, this chemical fertilizer with everything the roses needed, considering what the soil had and the water had in Rose Hills, in Whittier. So this is very accurate for Orange County too. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He's got 9 minerals that he figured the roses needed in Rose Hills. So that's quite a good fertilizer for roses. University of Florida created this product for palm trees. They said this is what the palms need. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's 10 minerals in here. So those are all quite good fertilizers to use. Again, the advantage that organics has is anything organic, and you can just say dead leaves would be a good organic fertilizer. Everything a living leaf has, this dead leaf has in it. So if you just cut off leaves and throw them on the ground, that's as good as any other fertilizer you're going to buy. But the main thing that organics do is they keep the soil organisms alive. And when you keep the soil organisms alive, this is the energy source for the soil organisms. They eat the leaves, they eat everything else they get. They break down that cellulose and they get energy out of that. It keeps the ground fluffy, keeps the soil breathing, keeps the roots happier too. So organics in the long run are much better. If you go a chemical, and again on the chemicals, if you're not accurate, you can get way out of balance. With the organics, you rarely go too far out of balance, especially if they're just things like seeds that were ground up or leaves. So they did a timing test on the mycorrhizal fungus to see how fast the mycorrhizal can return the leaf to the tree. They said as fast as 90 days, the nutrients in that leaf can get back into the same tree. The leaf falls in the ground 90 days later, the nutrients are back in the tree from the mycorrhizal recycling system. So that's pretty quick. So, and mycorrhizal fungi and bacteria in a compost pile aren't necessarily friendly to each other. So after we heard that, we said, let's stop making a compost pile. Let's just grind up the stuff in our yard and throw it back on the dirt. And it disappears just as fast. It's like 4 months, it's gone. That stuff is gone. So it's nice not to throw anything away. If you throw stuff away, then you got to add stuff to your garden. Okay, mulching. So, yes.
Well, like, avocado leaves seem like they take forever to break up. So would it be better to leave them like that, or try to chip them and grind them up?
Just leave them.
They
Plants.
stay home for a long time.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, a note, a friend of mine went down to Guatemala. He wanted to see how deep the leaves were underneath the wild avocado trees. 5 feet. He said he dug through 5 foot leaves to hit the dirt. He couldn't believe it. I mean, the Sierras underneath the oak trees, it gets pretty deep there too, a couple feet deep. So that's a lot of mulch on top of the ground. So one of the things we saw on YouTube and what they've been doing up in the Northwest and the Northeast too, a lot of the small farms up there said that they started covering their farms with 18 inches of ground up organic matter. And they said it does several things. It insulates the ground. It provides all the nutrition the plants need pretty much. No weed growth. But they said they also found out it created water. When you have that much stuff on top of the ground and it's cool, if it's moist and the air goes through there at night, water condenses on cool objects. So, because they were puzzled, they had some apple farms in Washington, bone dry in the summer, they'd have to water. But they noticed the forests next to them were green and lush, so they'd walk in there in the morning and all those dead leaves on the ground are just wet. So that's when they started to cover their farms, and they said 18 inches of mulch. And the way they get it, they said they just call up the local tree companies. They're chipping up trees in the area and then have them dump it on their property and get it that way. They said you can do the same. Just call up your local tree company to tell them if you're in our neighborhood, just dump it here. Tip them like $20 or something for coming. Otherwise, they'd have to take it to a dump somewhere or to a recycling center. And it'll generate nutrition, it'll insulate, stop the weeds, and even create some moisture in your garden. Here, not as good as if we were up near the ocean. Well, if you're near the coast, you can probably get a pretty good benefit out of it. They saw it in Texas. So I was listening to this back in the days, in the 80s, they didn't have YouTube. I got these tape lectures from these people in the series. They're talking about this phenomenon in Texas where they're having a bad drought in Texas. All the plants on the highways were dead. So they just brought the chippers out, chipped them up, put all the chippings on one side of the highway, and they said that side of the highway greened up. Even without rain, it greened up. They didn't know what was happening. Of course, Texas, the humidity is like 95%. So at night, that pile of mulch was creating a lot of moisture, and the plants started growing again. So
How about disease with that?
well, you don't want it on the leaves of your plant. Around the trunk of a tree, it's okay, but not on the leaves. And
So, let's say you're doing that in a vegetable garden, and you're putting a pile of leaves down where the region grows, where your vegetables are going, where the stuff isn't.
yeah, so the farms up in the Northwest said in their row crop area, they use about 1 foot deep. They pull aside to plant their plants. They put in plants that are already about 1 foot tall, and then they slowly put it back in place. So it's there. So you don't want to cover up too much of your plant with it. Of course, if it's dry, it won't do too much damage. If it's wet mulch, then it might start rotting. But
You said keep it away from the trunk or the stem of the plant?
not the trunk. Trunks are used to being buried.
Okay. So I'm not sure if I follow then. Are you saying they keep the mulch kind of away from the plant a little bit?
The little tiny plant. When you plant your row crops,
Okay.
they move the mulch aside, put the plant in the dirt, and then I don't think they put the mulch back real fast, but they eventually do.
Over the course of time.
Yeah.
I see.
Now on trees, on the East Coast, they're having a lot of trouble with trees putting mulch against the trunk, rotting the trees out. Well, we think it's a combination of the compost soil in the ground and the compost on top of the ground just rotting that tree out. We don't think, nature, there's nobody clearing away the dead leaves. You should be able to pile it up a few feet deep at least without any problem. But if you got mulch in the root system and you put dead leaves on top of that combination may be causing a lot of root or crown rot on that tree. There's not enough oxygen at that area. So, okay. So installing plants one of the things we've been doing, and this was a lecture about 3 weeks ago, so if you get on YouTube under Gary's Best Gardening, we showed you how to knock soil off of plants and replant them. So on this iris here, if I was going to replant this, I would take out of the pot and knock all the soil off. Now, the most gentle way to take soil off of root systems is with a hose, just with a nice stream of water. And you know, if you get off 80% of it, that's probably good enough. And then on a plant like this iris, cut the leaves real short. Takes away a lot of their water use, so that they have time to recover. It takes roots 2 weeks to recover from being washed. So if you cut about 80% of the leaves off this plant, 80% of the leaf surface area off, then you're fine. It'll be fine in the ground. You don't want to put it in total shade. We've done this in plants and put them in deep shade, they all die because they don't have any energy to recover. So you have to have some light on them. So what we used to do at our old store, we had a canopy, just a rare old canopy, and we'd throw the plants underneath there after we did this. We'd take off 100% of the grower soil and put them underneath that. Well, they'd get sun for about 4 hours of the day, but the rest of the day they'd be shaded. So that seemed to be we didn't lose any plants underneath there at all. So they seemed to be very fine with about 4 hour, a third of a day of sun on them. Not midday sun. We try to keep the midday sun off of them. A friend who has an orchard in Tustin bought some orange trees from the retail supplier instead of a wholesale supplier, so they were in that bad soil. So I told him, you got to take this dirt off if you want this thing to grow. So what they did is they took a couple bags, empty sacks of ours, and strung them up on stakes next to their little orange tree that they had bare rooted. And did that around May this year, and they didn't lose any of those. But that's just that shade. They had them on two sides of it, so they got the midday sun, but they didn't get morning or afternoon sun on them. So that seemed to be fine for them. So it doesn't take much. In fact, I did once. I took an orange tree, grapefruit tree, took all the soil off. We were having June gloom or May gloom, just put in the ground, didn't do anything. A few days later, the sun came out, it was 80 degrees, all the leaves fell off, and I thought, boy, I just killed this thing. But apparently, leaves falling off is plants saving themselves. That's an act the plant does. And a month later, it releafed, and it was fine after that. So now, if you want to know how to plant bougainvilleas, we tell people, because bougainvilleas have never liked the soil, well, at least for the last 30 years, they have not liked the soil the growers use. So they said, don't handle this by the trunk because it'll just pull right out of the dirt. Well, it's because they don't like that soil the growers use. The roots can't even grow in it. So we tell people to do now, you might cut the plant back by about half, shake all the soil off that thing, put in the ground. Within a week, all the leaves will fall off. And then 2 weeks later, it'll regrow and look fabulous from that point on. It'll be evergreen, bloom year-round. It won't do the things that bougainvilleas can have trouble with, which is winter. That no longer has trouble with winter when it doesn't have that compost around its root system. I told one of my new employees to do that. He was shocked. He goes, this thing is dying. But now you look at the bougainvilleas next to our entryways here, and they're just gorgeous plants. They grow like 10 feet a year. We got to keep trimming them. So there's a lot of things you can do to make things better. Now, if you have an expensive box tree, you don't want to lose it. So let's say this box tree is got fairly decent soil in it. So this is what the U.S. Department of Agriculture told us 20 years ago now to do. They said, don't put anything in the backfill because they know compost. They realized, U.S. Department of Agriculture realized that compost in the ground around trees is killing them. They said put air pipes in the ground on all sides of this root ball to keep the airflow down to the bottom of this root. The problem we have with box trees, 24-inch box trees, the root system is like 20 inches tall. Well, the roots can only breathe about a foot deep. So you're going to lose all these roots down here before the tree regrows new roots, which is going to set the tree back. So that's why they said put these air pipes down there. If you just get the perforated drain pipes, that's fine. Or we tell our customers, get our acid mix or straight bags of pumice rock. Our acid mix is 50% pumice rock. So pumice rock is volcanic rock, silicon dioxide, just like sand is, but it's full of air holes. You mix this into dirt, it breathes. The Pumice Society says that if you had 100% clay, you make it 20% pumice, it'll still breathe. That's pumice to pumice contact. We'd rather go a little higher than that. So we tell people, well, you can make it, if you have decent soil, you can make it either 25% pumice or maybe 50% of our acid mix, which is half pumice. Put it around the sides of this tree, the roots will breathe. Or you can just put it solid. You can, get our top pot, put it solid around this tree, the roots will breathe. Keep those roots alive. The roots will grow into the airy soil, hit the heavier stuff, and then grow in the zone where they can. But at least you won't have a setback during that time. So you can do this with any plant, just surround it with a lot of, one of my friends, contractor, installer, he would always, for the last 40 years, I think, he just said, I just surround my plants with sand. Never lose any of them. He was smart.
So you dig a foot deep normally?
Pardon?
You dig a foot deep?
Well, on this, in the case of a 24-inch box, you got to go all the way to the bottom. This is 22 inches of dirt. So you'll have to make a hole 20 inches deep, 22 inches deep. You want to match up the original soil with, the worst thing to do with any plant is to throw native soil on top of that. If native soil gets on top of this, native soil usually doesn't breathe as well. So the roots just suffocate. And the water can't even get in there either because the water won't go through our native soil fast enough. So you don't want any native soil on top of that if you can help it. You do want to make a good dirt basin to channel the water right through the original soil ball, especially this time of year. If you don't do this, your plant is toast. You have to get the water to go through here before it hits the native soil. Native soil has more clay in it than the soil in containers, and clay is like blotter paper. It sucks all the water away. So if you put water out here, this can be totally wet. This root system won't get any because this is like blotter paper all around it.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
Just as an example, like if let's say I went to the beach, gathered many gallons or buckets of sand, I had my native backyard soil, and I kind of dug it up, added sand, and I mixed it up, and I put it in a pot. Would that work?
Yeah.
Yeah, it would work.
We've done that.
As opposed to straight native soil.
Right. Well, the native soil, you can't have more than about, when I was a kid, he used soil just like this to grow plants in pots. He did not have pots this small when he grew plants. So when you have a pot this small and you fill it with this, it won't drain. So one concept that I didn't mention yet. If you have soil in a container and it's not a porous container, it's solid plastic like this, there's going to be a perched water table at the bottom. Soil is like sponge. So in the ground, it's like an endless sponge. You add water to the top, the water gets sucked away to the sponges below it. But in a pot, the soil is like a sponge. So in this pot here, if you water it, it'll drain out the whole till it gets to about here. In our top pot, it'll probably hold about an inch of water at the bottom, which is advantageous in our condition because there's plenty of oxygen in this water. But if you put this dirt in there, which is finer textured, the water table may be halfway up, and that might take too long to use up, and the roots may actually start drowning in that. So in a container, you can't have too much real dirt in it if it's a small pot. If it's 24-inch box, there's no issue because the perched water table is the same height in that type of soil no matter what size the container is. So in a 24-inch box, 2 inches of wet soil at the bottom may not be enough to hurt the plant. In a 6-inch pot like this, that's half of the dirt that may hurt it. So in this container, you want to make this coarser material so it holds less. There's less perched water table. That's why we have our top pot is pumice, perlite, sand, peat moss, and charcoal. I didn't even talk about these yet. So pumice is the lightest version of sand. Like when we did our testing back in the 1990s, sand grew the best plants. You put sand in a pot, not beach sand, it's too salty, but just wash sand, place sand. We use all different sands we can find. Put them in pots, grew plants in them with fertilizer. Absolutely spotless, gorgeous plants. Couldn't find any fault with that. Except if you had a bag that's full of sand, it's 100 pounds. It's like, okay, I can't sell that. So I talked to the guys at UC Riverside who were a little more reasonable, and they said, well, the lightest version of sand is pumice. Now, there are different weights of pumice. I mean, a soil researcher I talked to that was working in the space program, he had pumice from a volcano in New Mexico. You can put your hand on below it and it just floats. It's that lightweight. But we don't have access to that stuff, so we use the pumice we have, which is about 40 pounds per cubic foot versus 100, maybe 110 for sandy loam and about 100 pounds if it was sand. So less than half the weight of sand. So we use this as soil, but we found out it dried a little too fast, dried a little faster than sand does, than real sand does. So we decided, okay, let's add something to pumice to make it hold more water. Well, the proper thing would have been probably to add vermiculite to it. Vermiculite is the man-made version of clay. But we chickened down. We said, okay, we want it to look a little like the regular potting soil, so we added peat moss to it. And the guys at UC Riverside told us peat moss holds water, stores water better than any material they know of, and it's a natural material. Clay holds more water than peat, but clay won't let it go. Clay retains the water. Peat moss will totally dry up and let the plant have all the water. And peat moss will last 5 years, they said. So said, okay, we'll go with peat. It does shrink a bit over time, so that's the problem with peat. So we wanted pumice and peat. So our first try at a soil was our acid mix, which is just half and half. We thought, okay, let's get the stuff that holds water the best, the stuff that has most airflow in it. We got our acid mix. It's about 5.6 pH, so it's acidic because peat moss is acidic. Started growing blueberries, ferns, and things in that. And suddenly we noticed everything grew well on it. But it does shrink. It does shrink because it's half peat. So we started fooling around with the materials and see what we can do. We wanted to get more materials in there because it seems to us that each material dries out at a different rate. So if we put different materials in there, the soil kind of dries out bit by bit at a slower rate. The plant can shut down better because we notice plants that are in just pure peat moss, they look good and suddenly they're all wilted. They just shut down. The peat runs out of water too quickly, it seems. So we wanted to get some other materials in the soil that held water at different, different affinities for water. So we mixed the pumice with perlite, which is man-made pumice, and sand, and charcoal, and got our top pot, and that's what we use at the moment. I mean, if I redid this, I might add more vermiculite to it, or even just take the peat moss out and add the vermiculite, since vermiculite does hold water pretty well. But again, it won't look like what is sold as potting soil. It won't be brown anymore. So this is our top pot in action. So it does, you can see the white in there, but you can also see the peat moss in there too. And the top pot doesn't seem to shrink at all. It might be the roots are making up the volume of the peat moss, but we think actuality, when you have pumice, 2/3 of the volume is pumice, perlite, sand, and charcoal, and those things don't shrink. The peat moss would probably just sitting between those bigger particles. It's not making up the volume, because round big particles are 2/3 of the volume of the mix. And the peat moss, this is only 1/3 of the volume. It might just fit between the bigger particles, may not be contributing to volume at all. But anyway, it doesn't seem to shrink. Yes?
I was reading, I think it might have been moringa. Someone was saying online that the plant, I forget which one it was, either perlite or vermiculite. It likes one, but it doesn't do well in the other. What would be the actual difference, or is that information not really accurate?
Well, no, vermiculite holds water and perlite holds air.
Oh, that would be the difference. Okay.
So if you had too much vermiculite, it may rot out. Moringa tends to rot pretty easily,
Okay.
so maybe you're rotting out. Perlite would work fine, should work fine.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yes.
So let's say I had a bunch of raised beds that I put in a lot of compost soil, and I am getting like a lot of disease and rot. So what do you do? Like dump a bunch of sand in there and mix it up?
Throw it away. You got to throw it away.
Really?
Can't fix it. You can spread it lightly over the top of everything. If there's a high amount of compost and it's close to the surface, it'll degrade on its own. It'll disappear. But anytime you have a pile of it like that, you can't fix it. The oxygen level's too low. I don't think it could be more than about 2 or 3% compost in there to be livable.
So how would you feel? Like, I mean, I ordered it from Aldanaga.
Yeah, they taught me about dirt.
And
I did the same thing. So I brought in 17 truckloads of topsoil that was 60% sandy loam and 40% compost. This is back in 1990 before I knew anything. And planted my plants. They all looked good for a few months, and then within a year, about half the stuff rotted and fell over. I couldn't believe it. I'm going, okay, how come I can't grow plants? They said this was the best soil that was out there. Well, apparently I just didn't know enough about dirt. So that's when I started learning. I go, okay. So it took me 10 years to replace it with sandy loam. And what we noticed is that even after 10 years, when I was still digging some of this stuff out, the amount of plant roots in the topsoil that they had created, there's like one root every 6 inches going through that soil. Replaced it with this and redug the soil about half a year later, one root every 1/4 inch. So that's like 25 times more roots in this than in the soil they had sold me. And there was more roots growing, well, there was more roots growing near the surface and a whole bunch more roots growing in my native soil below it, which was clay. There's more roots in that than in the soil they sold me. And I talked to them about that, but they don't get it. They just don't have a clue that what they're selling is ruining people's yards. And I just can't believe, that somebody, well, it's the whole industry doesn't get it, because we had a hard time getting our potting soil through the EPA because they told us, where's your compost? It can't be potting soil.
All right.
So it's like, and they told me I had to prove that my potting soil was permanent. I had to have research that shows that it's permanent. I told them, well, it's got sand, it's got pumice, it's got perlite. These are all permanent materials. You want me to prove to you that these are permanent? It's like, okay, I got to prove that sand is real. Anyway, that's the state of our industry. I mean, it was so sad. Back in 2007, I read an article from Santa Monica. So this nursery got sued. They had sold all these strawberry trees to Santa Monica. They rotted and died. And I knew the company was Valley Crest, which is no longer around. I stopped buying from them at that time because all their trees rotted in the pots. So they sued, and the court says, okay, but the state court came back and said, you can't sue this company. They grew it exactly how the universities told them to grow this tree. So they can't be wrong. They can't be at fault. So that's the state of our industry. They're not at fault because the universities told them how to grow the plants. The universities apparently are the truth of our industry.
But if the results are showing something completely different, how does no one fix that?
No, I don't know. It's almost, to me, it's like that fable, Emperor's New Clothes. You couldn't be an expert to see the problem. Yes.
I know at UC Riverside they have that. They do a lot of studies on citrus. They grow a lot. I haven't been there, but I've asked them questions sometimes. So what do they grow their citrus?
The agricultural side of industry is fine. It's the horticultural side that's got the problems. So all the stuff I learn is from agricultural research. You look at that research, there's no problem with it. The soil is 1% organic. You can water as often as you like. The more frequently you water, the better the root system. What we've been told by the other side is totally wrong. So, that watering thing, I mean, they watered one side of the orchard daily, lightly, the other side deeply and frequently, and they surmised that the side they watered deeply and frequently have deeper, better roots. It wasn't true. The side that was watered frequently and lighter had a significantly bigger root system than the other side. So now they all water lightly and frequently because it's more efficient use of water. But waters just don't get that. They don't see that research. So all this stuff, yeah. Farms, we were told by the companies that supply farms, do not put any compost in the ground. It kills everything. They know that. The horticulture side doesn't get it. I've written to everyone at the top of the chain, and they said, we don't see this as a problem. Where are you coming from? Because they get no feedback. The problem we have, Steve, we've always been a grower retailer. We sell the stuff that we grow to our customers. So we get the feedback all the time. If we have a good product, we know about it. Nowadays, there's like 2 or 3 levels in between. So, you buy stuff, the grower sold it to the distributor, and the distributor sells it to the customer, and nobody talks to each other. So the growers don't know.
Well, I think as customers, we expect a lot of our plants to die, so we don't make a fuss over it.
Well, you
Maybe,
expect that the growers knew what they were doing is what?
Yeah, but I mean, when I buy plants and some of them die, I just think, well,
And they didn't used to do that way, though. But nowadays, yeah, most things you buy die because they're grown improperly. But you know how to fix them now. So, yes.
If you're, let's say, amending your soil with compost on the surface, comparing, let's say, you have nothing planted, but you're spreading compost maybe like a season before, several months before, as opposed to you've planted and now you're adding compost on top. Is there a big difference, or I mean, what would be the difference in the final result in growing the plant?
Wait a minute, I didn't catch that.
So let's say you have, I don't know, I'll give you 2 identical raised beds, let's say, and one you put compost on it on the surface, but you did have nothing planted, and then the other one you just planted, and then you put compost on the surface, and then you waited, several months or more for this, and then you planted there, or as opposed to, like I said, just planting initially and putting compost in the ground.
Well, it's a little better to put the compost down before you plant, well before you plant, but it's not a huge difference because once, you need those mycorrhizal fungi to really break it down fast, and they're associated with the plants.
Oh, I see.
They're symbiotic partners with the plants.
There wouldn't be any major noticeable differences between the two?
Not
methods?
huge. These things work pretty fast once they get going. The last subject to cover today is crop rotation. So it has a lot to do with how plants live. So the forest department's known this for a long time. The guys at the forest department are pretty sharp. So he knows that trees can live until they can't grow a bigger root system. So every year they grow new roots, the roots die, they have to grow new roots. They don't like to live in the same soil twice. So once the roots here die, they grow a little further. And then these die, and they'll grow a little further beyond that. But eventually, they can't support a bigger root system. So they said like redwood trees, they'll look great for 3,000 years, say, and they'll have a root system that's 1,000 yards across, say. But eventually, they can't do it anymore. They can't support their root system. And then the roots start dying back, and the tree dies relatively quickly once they reach that point. So they said the tree can look great for 3,000 years, and it might die in just 50, which to us is a long time, but in a tree life, that's all of a sudden they can't support a bigger root system, they just die. Because they're living within the old root system of their own selves. So when the tree dies, something else grows in that zone of dead tree roots. Weeds, grass, something not related, because you put that redwood tree back in there, it's in the middle of all this rotting redwood. Now redwood doesn't rot too easily, so those trees can live a long time. But something else grows, unless there's a fire. So the one thing that can get by this crop rotation business or this succession of plant life is if you have a really hot fire, you can sterilize the soil 10, 12 inches deep burn it up, and then the same trees can grow right back. So they said in temperate climates, North America, we get these forest fires, burns everything down. A few years later, the trees are back, all the same trees. Whereas they said in the Amazon rainforest, no fires. So they said the average distance between two trees of the same species was, I think it was 170 yards. No, 70 yards. I think it was 70 yards. So there's this hundreds of species of trees in the Amazon. They said they all look alike, but they're not related because they can't grow in a spot where one just died for 20, 30, 40 years. They can't live in there until that root system is totally decomposed and gone. Now, in Napa Valley, it's kind of strange. They do not let the farmers in Napa Valley grow anything but grapes. And grape plants are only good for about 30, 40 years because they fill the ground around them with dead grape roots. So after 30, 40 years, they're just so sick. They pull them all out, pull out as much root as they can, and they have to leave the ground fallow for 10 years. They have to wait for all those grape roots to decompose and be gone, and then they said the soil, they don't know what's going on. They said the soil is rejuvenated now. We can grow grapes again. It rejuvenates them when you don't grow them for a while. So that's crop rotation for you. You got to wait for those related roots to be out of there. I actually met a guy who worked in an apple orchard. He says, my job in college, if they ran over an apple tree with a truck, I'd have to dig the tree out, dig a hole this wide, this deep, dig another hole 40 feet away, the same size, switch the dirt, plant a new tree in that soil. Because they won't grow in that soil where the tree just, even though it didn't die, it was killed, now you have soil with rotting tree roots because it was killed. So the same thing happens with plants that happens with people. If you had someone chopped up in your house, little pieces of dead body all around, you would have to get rid of every single little piece to be healthy in there. It wouldn't kill you necessarily, but you'd be really sick. So that's why we rotate crops in the garden. So we were next to the organic farm in Irvine for 4 years. The head guy told me they're on a 10 crop rotation cycle, which takes about 3 or 4 years to get through 10 crops before they can grow the same crop again. Nothing related. So on the front side of this sheet, we have the vegetable families. So if you divide your yard into, say, your little farm plot into sections, I would say do at least 3, 4 is better, or even 5. Grow all the same plants in that fun family in one section. So all your solanum family, which is tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, in the one section. Then the next year move to the next section. Next year move to the next section. Keep on moving until you get 4 years down the road, you get back to the first section. So try to do something like that. I mean, 2 years is better than nothing. But the more beds you can have, the better. Of course, I've got a lot of customers, all they want to do is grow tomatoes. They don't want to grow anything else. So we tell them, okay, this year, grow them in pots. Use potting soil, grow them in pots. You can do that. That's rotating the soil. That's what the guy did on the tree farm. You rotate the soil.
Is there a way around that? To be able to plant in the same soil again?
Real hot fire. It's got to be really hot.
You can make your charcoal in your garden.
We talk like several hundred degrees kind of, or
Well, it's got to be, they steam sterilize the nursery. So I had a friend who grew seedlings. They used the same sand every year, every time they grew seedlings, but they would bake the sand in an oven, they got to be over 150 degrees, maybe 170 degrees to kill off all the diseases and organisms that are inhabiting the dead stuff, cook it, and then reuse the same sand over and over and over. So you can cook it. There's that solarization where you cover it with plastic. Here, last year we actually had enough heat. You need 2 weeks in a row of over 90 degrees. It works better in Fresno because even in the nights there, it's in the 80s still, so that soil is just hot. But here, this year we're not getting the heat to do that solarization thing where you just heat it up with clear plastic. Fumigation works. So you see, the strawberry farms, where they plant the same strawberries year after year, they have that clear plastic. That's solarization. Well, that's not solarization. They have the clear plastic on top. they put the fumigates underneath, which sterilize, that just wipes out all the living organisms in the ground with the chemical. So even though there's dead strawberry roots in there, they're not harmful because they've been sterilized. And then they can grow strawberries year after year with that. The organic farmers use the black plastic because if you have clear plastic on the ground, all the weed seeds grow instead of the plants. So you can't use clear plastic unless you sterilize the ground.
Is there any kind of something that works like a fumigant but is, let's say, organic? Like, for instance, tomatoes. And I wanted to sterilize that. Is there anything I could put in there that wouldn't be bad for us or for the environment that would kill off those particular organisms?
Well, the only thing possible might be boiling water, but that's pretty dangerous to haul around for a human. It's got to be hot. It's got to be hot.
Hydrogen peroxide or something.
I don't know. I don't know. Soil is hard to penetrate with a lot of things. Well, yeah, I guess you can, throw gasoline on it and burn it, or I guess alcohol would burn cleaner. But so heat does it. Heat can sterilize, and that's about it. I mean, double digging the bed works, but I had someone do it one time, and they said we never do it again. But in England, it's easier because it's a lot wetter there. The soil is softer because of it's moist. So double digging a bed, since we know the roots only go down about a foot, if you take this foot of soil and pile it over here, and take the next foot of soil and pile it over here and reverse them going back in, you've got pretty much clean dirt on top of the ground now. That's double digging, but that's a pain. Yeah. You can do, you might be able to do stuff like that in a raised bed, double dig the bed. I mean, dirt's pretty cheap to buy. It's expensive to throw away. That's the only thing hard about dirt. I mean, it took me 10 years. See, we have at the nursery and at Old Start we did too. We had a 6 cubic yard trash bin or a 4 yard bin, whatever size that is. And I could put a half a yard of dirt in there per week. So it took me 10 years. I took out 100. Well, I only did about 150 yards because the apples and the grass lawn didn't seem to care about that composty soil. But everything else did better once I changed that dirt away. So, okay, I think I covered just about everything. Anybody have any questions? Well, one last note. So, in agriculture, they know what good soil is. Horticulture, they don't get it. They always use ground up trees as soil. In agriculture, the journals I've seen, they said these materials are great for growing plants and like especially in hothouse gardening. Hothouse gardening is real expensive to do underneath glass, so they have to have plants that do really well, better than they do in the ground. So they use things like they said sand, perlite, pumice are all used as growing mediums. Clay pellets are considered the top of the line, more expensive, but they work the best. You can think of these are clay beads, so they hold water and nutrients well. But they're beads, so that the air gets through there very well. So this is like the most expensive growing medium you can get, which then you would use to grow the most expensive crop in the world, which is marijuana. So you see a lot of the marijuana farms use clay pellets because they grow the fastest in this material. As long as it gets watered every few hours, they grow really fast in that material. A lot of hothouse farms use rock wool. And some even use plastic foam. So it's kind of like that, yeah. Get the airflow in there. I don't know, it's special density, so it sucks up the moisture, wicks up the water too. They said among the organic materials, the only things that have worked in the trade, peat moss, coconut coir, and rice hulls. And charcoal. Charcoal, they said, works too. Charcoal is inert, doesn't break down. Rice hulls are essentially inert. These guys are supposed to be 90% silica, almost the same as real dirt. So they said rice hulls can be used in place of perlite. It's kind of light and soft. coconut coir and peat moss, they know how long these work. They're good for a good 5 to 8 months as a growing medium. Beyond that, they're too sludgy and slimy, so they can't work, but they know them. They said the problem with wood products and bark products like this is that they don't know how long they're going to last. Because one piece of bark can be totally different from the next. Even a piece of wood, they said one side of it will decompose fast, and the other side, they can't tell a farmer how long this stuff will last, so they just can't use it in hothouse farming. Of course, in the nursery industry, that's all they use. It's the stuff they can't predict. So it's just sad. I mean, they know it'll last at least 5 months. Is all they can say. It'll last 5 months, and after that, it's your problem. You've overwatered your plant. That's what's going on. So, okay. Thank you.